Twice a year, if you were the sheriff of an English county in the 1100s, you made a journey you did not enjoy. You rode to Westminster. You were shown into a room, and in that room stood a table, about 10 feet long, 5 feet wide, with a raised lip around the edge so nothing could roll off. Across it was stretched a cloth of black, marked out in stripes about the width of a man's hand, so that the whole thing looked like an enormous chessboard. You were not there to play a game. You were there to account for money. On the far side of that cloth sat the most powerful officials in the kingdom, and they were called, with no irony at all, the Barons of the Exchequer. A clerk began placing counters on the squares, pounds in one column, shillings in the next, pence in the last. As you spoke, as you explained what you had collected and what you had spent, the counters moved. What the king was owed on one side, what you had actually paid on the other, and the gap between those two rows of counters was your problem to explain, out loud, to men who had heard every excuse a sheriff could invent. When it was over, and only when it was over, a clerk took a length of willow and cut notches into it to mark the sum. Then he split the stick down the middle, lengthways, straight through the notches. One half was handed to you. The other half stayed with the treasury. Match the two halves later, and the notches lined up exactly. A receipt no one could forge. Hold on to that stick, that humble piece of split willow, because 7 centuries from now, a careless afternoon with a pile of them is going to burn the Houses of Parliament to the ground. But we will get there. For now, sit with what you have just watched. This is not a barbarian warlord dividing loot by firelight. This is not a king pointing at a pile of silver and trusting his memory. This is not, whatever you were told about the so-called Dark Ages, a world that had forgotten how to run itself. This is double-entry thinking, standardized procedure, and audited public accounts, happening in England around the year 1170. And the strangest part of the whole scene is this. Almost every office in that room began as a servant, emptying the king's chamber pot, guarding the king's door, or folding the king's shirts. That last line isn't a figure of speech. It's close to the literal truth. To see why, you have to throw out a picture almost everyone carries around. The picture of medieval government as a king on a throne, barking orders, ruling by mood and muscle. The idea that anything you'd recognize as a real state, offices, records, salaries, procedure, is a modern invention that arrived with steam engines and paperwork. It's a tidy story. It's also wrong by about 700 years, and the proof sits in the one place nobody thinks to look for a government, the king's house. The Latin term is domus regis, the house of the king. Not a metaphor for the realm, the actual household. The people who cooked his food, poured his wine, kept his money, guarded his door, and looked after his clothes. In the early 12th century, that household was the central government of England, because the king was the government, and wherever the king physically went, his power went with him, packed onto horses and carts, and hauled down muddy roads from one castle to the next. We know exactly how that household worked, in remarkable detail, because someone wrote it down. Around the year 1136, just after the death of Henry I, a document was drawn up called the Constitutio Domus Regis, the establishment of the king's household. Historians think, though they can't prove it, that the author was Nigel, the king's treasurer. And what it contains is almost comically mundane for something so important. It is, essentially, a payroll. It lists every officer of the household, from the top of the ladder to the bottom, and it tells you what each one was owed, not just in wages, but in bread, in wine, in candle ends. How many loaves the chancellor got, how much wine for the steward, what the man who looked after the tents was allowed to eat. It is the founding document of English administration, and it reads like the accounts of a very large, very fussy country estate. Here's the detail that should stop you. In that list, the Chancellor, soon to be one of the 2 or 3 most powerful men in the kingdom, sits in the same document, in the same grades of rank and ration, as the master butler and the keeper of the king's hunting dogs. Because at that moment, that's what he was, a senior member of the domestic staff, a servant with an unusually important job. And this is the thing that makes the whole story worth telling. Over the next 2 centuries, one by one, those household jobs are going to grow up. They're going to stop being the king's personal servants and start being the kingdom's permanent institutions. The man who keeps the king's letters becomes a department. The man who counts the king's coins becomes a court of law with a treasury. And each one, as it grows too big and too busy to follow the king around, is going to settle down in one fixed place, Westminster, and carry on running the country whether the king is there or not. Whether the king is alive or not, the historian T.F. Tout had a phrase for that process. He called it the department's going out of court. Watch it happen, and you're watching a medieval household turn, piece by piece, into a modern state. So let's take those pieces one at a time. Start with the words. Every act of medieval kingship had the same problem. The king could say anything he liked. Getting the kingdom to treat what he said as law, that was a different matter entirely. Say you're the king, and you want to grant a loyal knight a piece of land. You say the words out loud. Fine, but you'll be dead in 20 years, and that knight's grandson will be standing in a courtroom trying to prove the land is his, and the words you spoke into the air will be worth exactly nothing. What he needs is a document, a physical, permanent, provable thing that says the king willed it, and, crucially, a mark on that document that no one can fake. That mark was the Great Seal, a disc of wax, pressed with the king's image on both sides, hanging off the bottom of the parchment. And the office that produced the document and guarded the seal was the Chancery. The Chancery was the writing arm of the English state. It drafted the charters, it issued the writs, it turned the king's spoken will into sealed, enforceable, filed reality. Nothing the law touched was really finished until the Chancery had drawn it up and hung the wax on it. You wanted to marry an heiress, appoint a sheriff, prove a debt, or get the king's justice in a dispute. None of it was real until a Chancery clerk had written it out, and it had passed under that seal. The man in charge of all of it was the Chancellor. Now, that word, Chancellor, it's worth stopping on, because its origin is one of the great quiet jokes in the history of government. It comes from the Latin cancellarius, and a cancellarius, in the late Roman world, was not a statesman. He was a doorman. Specifically, he was the usher who stood at the cancelli, the latticed screen, the barrier of crossed wooden bars that separated the judge's seat in a Roman law court from the crowd pushing in behind it. His whole job was to man the railing, to decide who got past the lattice and who didn't. That's it. That is the ancestor of the office. The title of the Lord Chancellor of England, for centuries the highest legal officer in the land, keeper of the king's conscience, descends, in a straight and unbroken line, from a man whose entire function was standing at a fence. If that gap between the humble start and the mighty finish landed for you the way it did for me when I first ran it down, that's genuinely worth a like. It's the simplest way to tell the algorithm to push this to more people who'd enjoy this kind of thing. But the deeper point isn't the joke. It's why that doorman rose so high. He controlled access. In a Roman court, he controlled who reached the judge. In a medieval kingdom, whoever held the seal and drafted the documents controlled access to the king's authority itself. And access to the king's authority was the most valuable thing in the country. Control the paperwork, and you sit near the center of everything. Which is exactly why the men who held the office were rarely nobodies. In 1155, a young, brilliant, wildly capable administrator named Thomas Becket became Henry II's Chancellor. And for 7 years, he ran the machinery of English government so well and lived so lavishly that he was arguably the second most powerful man in the kingdom. You may know how his story ended. Years later, and in a very different role, on the stone floor of Canterbury Cathedral. But the Chancery is where he made his name. A generation later, a man named Hubert Walter held the office. And Hubert, who we'll meet again, did something that tells you everything about where this was heading. He started keeping copies, systematically. Every charter the Chancery issued, recorded on a roll of parchment for the record. The charter roll. Think about what that means. The office had stopped trusting memory, and even stopped trusting the single original document. It was now keeping its own archive of everything it did. That is not a servant folding the king's shirts. That is a bureaucracy. So that's the words handled, the office that made the king's will permanent. 2 servants into this story, and we've watched a doorman become the highest lawyer in England. Now for the one that made the king rich, the biggest department of them all, and the reason we started this whole thing standing at that checkered table. Quick thing before we do. This channel takes exactly this approach to the medieval world, pulling the real machinery out from under the Hollywood version, one system at a time, until the whole thing actually makes sense. If that's the kind of history you want more of, subscribing is how you catch the next one. Now, the money. We already saw what the exchequer looked like from the sheriff's side of the table. Now stand on the other side and look at the machine. The name gives away the trick. Scacarium in Latin, échiquier in Old French. It just means chessboard. The department was named after its own furniture because that checkered cloth wasn't decoration. It was a calculating tool, a giant abacus laid flat. Each column stood for a unit of money, pence, shillings, pounds, and up into the tens and hundreds of pounds, and you did the arithmetic by physically sliding counters from square to square, which mattered enormously because a lot of the men who had to follow the sums couldn't necessarily do the arithmetic in their heads or on parchment. The board let everyone in the room see the calculation happen, debt on one side, payment on the other, the shortfall staring up at you in little heaps of counters. It was accountancy you could watch. And we know all of this in almost embarrassing detail, thanks to one book. Around 1179, a royal treasurer named Richard FitzNeal sat down and wrote the Dialogus de Scaccario, the Dialogue of the Exchequer. It's written as a conversation, a master answering a student's questions, walking through exactly how the whole institution ran. The officers, the procedures, the cloth, the counters, the rolls, the tallies. There is nothing else quite like it in 12th century Europe. An insider's operating manual for a working government department. And here's the detail that makes it almost poetic. Richard FitzNeal was describing a system that his own family had largely built. His great-uncle was Roger of Salisbury, the bishop who had assembled the exchequer into a working machine under Henry I around 1110. His father Nigel had run it after him. Richard was, in effect, writing the family business into history. The records that machine produced were called pipe rolls, long sheets of parchment, sewn end to end, one set per county, carrying each sheriff's debts forward year after year. Some of them survive. You can still read, 8.5 centuries later, exactly what a given English county owed the crown and what it paid. That is a state that does not forget. Now here's where we have to correct the myth head-on. The picture of the medieval king ruling by personal whim, deciding things by mood, by favor, by whoever shouted loudest at dinner, doesn't survive contact with the pipe rolls. This was a system with rules the king himself was expected to follow, standardized, auditable, staffed by professionals who knew the procedure cold. The whim of the king had been boxed in by the record of the kingdom. But a machine like this needed someone to run the country while the king was away. And the Norman and early Plantagenet kings were away constantly, off fighting in Normandy or Anjou or on crusade. So a second great office grew up alongside the treasury, the justiciar, the king's deputy, his viceroy, the man who held England in his hands while the king held France. And these were not minor figures. Ranulph Flambard ran the machinery of government for William Rufus so ruthlessly, squeezing revenue out of every vacant bishopric he could get his hands on, that he's often called the first man to wield the powers of a justiciar, even though the title itself didn't exist yet. Ranulph de Glanville governed England as Henry II's justiciar, while Henry fought in France, and lent his name to the first great treatise on English common law, though whether he actually wrote it is a question historians genuinely argue about to this day. If you've got a view on who really held the pen, the comments are the place for it. That one's never been settled. And then there was Hubert Walter, who we met keeping the charter roll, and who at various points was simultaneously Chief Justiciar, Lord Chancellor, and Archbishop of Canterbury. One man holding the top of the government, the top of the paperwork, and the top of the English church, all at once, which points at the danger. An office that runs the country in the king's absence can start to rival the king himself. And that is exactly what happened. The justiciars grew so powerful that the office became a threat to the crown, until Henry III finally broke the last great justiciar, Hubert de Burgh, in 1232, and simply let the office die. Its powers were carved up and handed out to smaller, safer men. No single deputy would ever hold that much again. The servants, in other words, had started to become a problem. So put yourself in the king's shoes for a moment. Every great department you inherited has done the same thing. It grew up, moved out, settled at Westminster, and started running on its own rules. Rules that increasingly told you what you could and couldn't do. The Chancery has its procedures. The Exchequer has its audit. Your grandfather's personal servants have become the establishment. So what does a king who wants to actually get things done, quickly, on his own authority, without 3 offices and a filing system telling him no, what does he do? He reaches back into his household, and he pulls out a fresh tool that hasn't been tamed yet. That's the pattern that runs through the next 2 centuries, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. When the old offices go out of court and turn into slow, formal, rule-bound institutions, the king simply promotes another intimate, domestic part of his household into a new instrument of personal power. It happened first with the chamber, the king's private financial room, and then, most dramatically, with the wardrobe. Yes, the wardrobe. It started as exactly what the name says, the room where the king's clothes, jewels, and treasure were kept. A closet. But because it was physically close to the king and traveled with him everywhere, its clerks were perfectly placed to handle his ready cash on the road, to pay soldiers, buy supplies, move money fast while the great stationary Exchequer sat back at Westminster, grinding through its formal audit. And so this closet full of clerks grew, in the 13th and early 14th centuries, into a genuine department of state. Under Edward I, the wardrobe was funding armies and running war finance. The historian T.F. Tout called it, memorably, the brain and hand of the court. A room for storing the king's shirts had become the nerve center of the English war machine. And the wardrobe had its own seal to make things happen fast. The Privy Seal, the king's private seal, smaller and less formal than the Great Seal, and far quicker to use because it traveled with him instead of sitting in the Chancellor's keeping. With the Privy Seal, the king could fire off orders on the move. Even the Exchequer and the Chancery could find themselves taking instructions from this little household seal. You can probably guess what happened next. The same thing that always happened. The tool got powerful, so the barons moved to control it. In 1312, the nobility forced Edward II to pull the Privy Seal out of the wardrobe and hand it to its own independent keeper. And with that, the Privy Seal went out of court too, and became yet another formal department. So the kings reached for an even smaller, even more personal seal, the signet, and started the whole cycle over again. That's the real engine of medieval English government. Not a straight line from primitive to modern, a loop. The king domesticates a servant into an institution. The institution grows independent. The king reaches deeper into the household for a new servant. Repeat. Every modern British ministry is, in a sense, a household chore that finally got out of the house. Now, that stick. Remember the split willow tally from the very beginning, the sheriff's forgery-proof receipt. The Exchequer used those wooden tallies for roughly 600 years. 6 centuries of England's public finances, recorded in notches on sticks. The system was finally abolished in 1826, and by then, the government had accumulated an enormous, worm-eaten backlog of the things sitting in storage at Westminster. In October of 1834, someone decided to get rid of them. 2 cartloads of old Exchequer tally sticks were carried down to the basement of the House of Lords, to be burned in the underfloor furnaces that heated the chamber above. The workmen overfed the furnaces. The flues beneath the floor of the Lords overheated. The paneling caught, and on the night of the 16th of October, 1834, the medieval Palace of Westminster, the ancient heart of English government, burned to the ground. The Houses of Parliament were destroyed by their own obsolete accounting system. The building you picture today, with its great clock tower, is the replacement they had to build afterward. That is the single most quietly astonishing fact in this entire story, and it's the kind of thing that's worth saving for the right moment in a conversation. Mention that Parliament was burned down by a pile of medieval tax receipts, and watch the face of whoever you're talking to. And it leaves you with something bigger than a fire, because the offices themselves didn't burn. The Chancellor of the Exchequer still runs the British Treasury today, and that title is a direct, living fossil of the checkered cloth we started at. The word Chancellor still sits at the top of that office, carrying its Roman doorman with it. There is still, to this day, a member of the British Cabinet called the Lord Privy Seal, a job named after a wax stamp that hasn't been meaningfully used in centuries. The household went out of court, but it never really left. So what do you actually take away from all this, standing back from the fire? 3 things. The first is a simple correction of the record. Government in medieval England was not crude, and it was not improvised. By the reign of Henry I, around 900 years ago, England already had salaried officials, standardized procedures, a professional treasury that audited its accounts twice a year, and written records so thorough that some of them survive for you to read today. The Dark Ages did not misplace the art of running a state. They were quietly rebuilding it. The second is a shift in how you see the machinery all around you now. Every great department of a modern government, the treasury that taxes you, the office that keeps the official records, the seal that makes a document legally real, did not descend from some grand theory of the state. It descended from a servant, from the man who counted the coins, the man who kept the letters, the man who guarded the clothes. Government didn't come down from philosophers. It grew up out of a household, one promoted servant at a time. And the third is the part that stays with me. Every one of those kings thought these people worked for him. His treasurer, his chancellor, his clerks, his servants. But the offices they built outlasted every single one of those kings. The men died, the dynasties fell, the Norman line, the Plantagenets, the whole cast of this story, gone. And the Exchequer kept counting. The Chancery kept writing. The institutions the servants built quietly became more permanent than the crown they were built to serve. That is how a state is actually made. Not in a coronation, but in the slow, unglamorous business of servants who kept better records than their masters. Here's my question for you, and I'd like an honest answer in the comments. If you'd been dropped into that world with a talent for it, which office would you have wanted? The Chancery, with the seal and the king's ear, and the shortest path to real power, or the Exchequer, with the checkered cloth and the records and the quiet certainty that you controlled the money? Chancellor or treasurer? Pick one, and tell me why. A closet became a war office, a doorman's title became the highest law in the land, and a bundle of counting sticks, in the end, burned down the very parliament they'd helped to fund. The people in that room folding shirts and stacking counters weren't building a monument. They were just doing the job in front of them. They built the state by accident, and it's still standing.